Hello, A1 students. Let's start our Bible study lesson with a nice song part of it. I'd rather have Jesus than silver or gold. I'd rather be His than have riches untold. I'd rather have Jesus than houses or lands. I'd rather be led by His nail-pierced hand than to be the king of a vast domain and be held in their sin's dread sway. I'd rather have Jesus than anything this world affords today. I'd rather have Jesus than worldly applause. I'd rather be faithful to His dear cause. I'd rather have Jesus than worldwide fame. I'd rather be true to His holy name than to be the king of a vast domain and be held in sin's dread sway. I'd rather have Jesus than anything this world affords today. I'd rather have Jesus than anything this world affords today. And ladies and gentlemen, that was very much the story of Joseph. Joseph, he was the one who was betrayed by his brothers, who was sent to Egypt, and who became the second most important person in Egypt, and through whom God also continued to build and bless His church, even when in a world that was not Christian at all. The name Joseph actually means, may God give increase. May God add. And indeed, through Joseph, the people increased. His family grew really very big in the land of Goshen in Egypt. And so we read last time in verse 8 of Exodus, now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. In Exodus 1:9, and he said to his people, look, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Verse 10, come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and it happen in the event of war, that they also join our enemies. We talked about how this Pharaoh was really quite an insecure man, because the Jews did their work, and they actually did not do anything to give him reason, cause for worry. But he was worried anyway. And we see then that in the same chapter which we read last time, that the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and grew. The more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and grew. Now that's remarkable, because you expect, if you have weeds in your garden and you deal with them and you treat them harshly, then most of them will die. They diminish in number. And Pharaoh saw these Jews as weeds in his kingdom, so to speak. And he dealt with them harshly, because he didn't want them to grow bigger and more powerful. And yet, in God's providence, the people multiplied and grew. Which is, of course, going back right to Genesis, the mandate that God gave to his people there, to multiply and increase and fill the earth. And that's still the church's commission today. And the irony is that also today, when there's pressure on the church tends to grow. And that's a strange phenomenon. But what often happens is Christians, in the face of threats and adversity, they get noticed. They get noticed by other people in their society. That they continue to be faithful to God. That they show trust in God. It helps them to show Christ to a world that is confused by all sorts of conflicting thoughts, people who don't really have a reason for living other than live it up for the day. We talked in our Bible study about how the history of the world is perceived as cyclic. You remember we talked about The Lion King, this movie, brilliant movie, but it is not a Christian one because it is a cycle of life. Some of you have seen it, may have heard about that cycle of life. There's getting born, living, dying, become again the grass that the antelope eats and so forth. Right? And so, sorry, I just looked if the recording was still going. It seemed to be okay. And so, this cycle of life is kind of an endless treadmill. I saw once on TV a film clip of Bolero. It's a very haunting kind of repetitive movement in music, and in that movie the movie maker put this whole row of all sorts of animals starting from a distance and trotting in the dusty environment, heads down, bowed, walking, endless row, going nowhere. And that is really the situation of people without God. But those with God, they multiply and grow. And I don't know about you, but I often pray for the church, that the church may continue to grow, both in purity and also in numbers. And that's why our mission work is so important. And also your personal witness in the community. As I said before, 1 out of 100 persons read the Bible, but 99 read you and me. What do they read? Do they see Christ-likeness? Do they see it in your home, in you, the way you work in these difficult circumstances now, honoring your father and your mother, and doing your work for the Lord? If you can agree with the song I just sang, I'd rather have Jesus than anything. But this is how you have Jesus, by showing that you are serious about doing your job, not for Mr. Zeltman, not for your parents, but for the Lord Jesus Christ. Because you all told me you're Christians, and this is the way you can show it, especially in circumstances like today. Okay, back to the church in Egypt then. They continue to grow. Pharaoh didn't like it at all. And we said the importance of names. We talked about Abram and Sarah. The name Joseph actually is a name that tells the story of the people in Egypt. It stays there for many years in slavery. How many years? If you said 400, you're right. You know, Genesis 15, the prophecy given to Abram. Read Exodus chapter 1 once more for yourself. And notice that a church that is persecuted tends to grow. China, the church is bigger there, so I've read, than the Communist Party of China. It's hard to get the exact numbers, but the estimate is between 70 and 120 million people there are Christians. But they are in hiding. It's growing. In Middle Eastern countries like Iran, a very strict Muslim country, we see there the fastest growing Christian church. So I've read through agencies like the Middle East Reform Fellowship, who beam the gospel into those countries. And these people are certainly in danger physically, and yet the church grows. It's really a miracle of God. Now, I'm going to put on the board a task for you. Have a look in a moment. After I've talked you through the task, you are asked to do a few jobs. I'm waiting for the picture to show clearly. All right, now firstly, get onto this one here. We just talked about it. It said the more they multiplied and grew, the more they were oppressed, it says there. You find it in Exodus chapter 1, right? The more they multiplied and grew, the more they were oppressed. This is still the case today. Church under persecution. Explain how this can be. First of all, it is God's work. So this is what you write in your book, please. It is God's work. He built his church. And secondly, people get interested. Now there are people who get interested as they're getting curious, but also people get interested because God calls them, as they are written in the book of life. So God uses this to call his, where do I put this? Here, elect out of the world. Okay, so you see the red here, God uses this to call his elect. So if you write that in your book, please, you can do it right now, if you're really quick, otherwise do it later. But then I have a job for you to do over the next few lessons. You don't have to finish it today, this is what it says. Briefly summarize in writing how Jacob and his family ended up in Egypt. Now for that, you read Genesis 37 and Genesis 39 to 46 verse 6. Now you don't need to read everything there, you just pick the main points, the main events in a few paragraphs. Only 50 to 100 words, write by hand in your exam book or type your findings. If you go a bit over 100 words, that's fine by me too. Less than 50, nah, then you haven't done a good job, I think. So make sure you get at least that in. Alright? So in your own words, write how history at the time unfolded sequentially, that is in sequence, like the one event after the other. Okay, sequence, sequentially, just so you know the word. If you're not sure of the word, look it up in the dictionary, right? But that's what it really means. One event after the other. This happened, there was famine in Egypt, and the famine spread to the rest of the then known world, also in Canaan, and Jacob's family was there and suffering, and then they did this, and then they did that. Just basically, flowchart fashion, right down, this happened, and that happened, and that happened, and that's how Joseph ended up in Egypt, and that's how then Jacob ended up in Egypt, because Joseph's brothers came, and then eventually also their father Jacob came and settled there. Okay, so write that down. That's a job that you have to do. Fairly quick job. Shouldn't take you more than 15 minutes. And make sure it gets in your book. When do you have this finished, Mr. Zandman? Well, you have to have it finished when we have a Bible study test, for which I haven't set a date. Remember, this is part of your 20 points job. So make it complete and make it tidy, as you all have been doing so brilliantly to date. Right, the rest of the time we're going to the video again. Remember this rabbi that was interviewed about the Exodus, and then he gets asked the question, what is it that you believe in the Torah? The Torah is the Jewish name for the Old Testament, right? Let's listen here again. We just go a little bit into this. So that's for the rest of the time. I'll start it and I'll switch the light off so you get it more clearly.
That seems to be...
Well, in other words, things that aren't facts can be truths.
What part of the Torah would you grant to be based upon historical reality?
I can't tell you. I don't know. And although it may irk people, I don't care.
If the leading scholars agree with the most outspoken atheists and agnostics, if even some rabbis agree with the most skeptical archaeologists that there's no evidence at all that the Exodus ever really happened, then what are the rest of us supposed to think? If none of it happened, then the two religions of the Bible, Judaism and Christianity, are both based on a gigantic lie. It was a type of question that troubled a filmmaker from Minneapolis named Timothy Mahoney. As he probed more deeply, little did Mahoney realize how far his journey would take him.
The more I looked into the Exodus, the more I realized its significance. I knew I had to investigate this story for myself. And the first step was to explore whether there was any hard evidence for the Exodus at all. I began my journey by traveling to the very place the Bible says it happened, the ancient land of Egypt. I was raised as a Christian, and I remember hearing amazing stories from the Bible as a child, and I believed them. Stories about an ancient family of shepherds, the sons of Jacob, who came from a foreign land to Egypt. They were enslaved by the Pharaoh, then miraculously delivered out of Egypt. and journeyed across the desert to conquer the promised land. But as I grew older, I was challenged to lose those beliefs. Now, I just wanted to know the truth.
The Exodus is believed by most scholars to have occurred in the reign of Ramesses II. Ramesses was Egypt's greatest builder king. Were these mighty monuments built on the sweat and toil of Hebrew slaves?
If experts say there's no evidence during the time of Ramesses, why do they think he's the pharaoh of the Exodus? I'm no historian, so I had to find a way to visualize how the history of ancient Egypt related to the events of the Bible. The thought came to me to imagine a wall of time extending back to the earliest moments of civilization. On the first level, Egyptian history, and above it, the events recorded in the Bible. And at the bottom, a timeline of absolute dates and a movable base to gauge the events of history, with great pylons marking every 1,000 years.
Over the course of 2,000 years, Egypt experienced three great periods of power. It began with the Old Kingdom, with its great pyramids of stone. Then came the Middle Kingdom, the high point of art and literature. Finally, the New Kingdom, with its vast empires that dominated foreign lands. These great periods of power were
Old,
followed by
Middle,
dark periods of
New.
disunity and weakness. Ramesses II was a pharaoh of the New Kingdom who ruled a grand empire and filled Egypt with his monuments. There's one crucial passage in the Bible that leads many to chain the Exodus event to the time of Pharaoh Ramesses, and what is known as the Ramesses Exodus theory.
The key to that theory is the building of the city of Ramesses, mentioned in Exodus 1:11. The Hebrews are making bricks to build the city of Ramesses, or the storage facilities of Ramses.
Professor James Hoffmeyer is one of the few Egyptologists who has written extensively on the biblical Exodus.
This important city, which we know Ramses II built, is being excavated even as we speak and continues to be studied. This city has a very brief history. By around 1100 BC, the city's gone. It has a very narrow history of no more than 200 years. So the question is, if this building project that the Israelites are involved in is Ramses II's Delta residence, then we have no escape but to say this is an important chronological marker, and that can only be somewhere in the 13th century BC.
Dates in the BC period can be confusing to work with because they move in the opposite direction to modern AD dates. The farther back you go in time, the bigger the BC number. So the Ramesses Exodus theory places the Exodus about 250 years before 1000 BC, or at about 1250 BC. I wanted an Egyptian perspective, so I went to see Mansour Barayak, Director General of Antiquities for Luxor, one of Egypt's most important archaeological sites. I asked Mansour if he was in agreement that there was no evidence for the early Israelites or the Exodus in Egypt.
Nobody knows what the sand of Egypt can tell of secrets. Maybe in the excavation we'll find some evidences. But so far, there is no documented evidence about the Exodus. But we know the Exodus from the Holy Books. It's mentioned in Quran, in the Holy Quran. It's in the Holy Bible. But in the ground, we have no evidence.
Well, it wasn't as if I hadn't heard this before, but I was still hopeful of finding something in the ruins of this magnificent civilization. What I really needed, though, was physical evidence of the cultural group that the Israelites were a part of, Semites, coming down to live in Egypt from a land called Canaan.
The problem is that no archaeological evidence has turned up for these Semites in the city built by Ramesses II.
But then I heard of something that seemed astonishing. New archaeological discoveries of a city and a people that appeared to match the biblical story, made at the very location of the city of Ramesses, where the Bible places the Israelites.
Mahoney would be interviewing one of the world's most respected Egyptologists. Professor Manfred Bitak and his Austrian team have been digging in Egypt's delta for over 30 years at the site of Avaris. Avaris lies directly below the southern sector of the city of Ramesses.
I asked Manfred to tell me about these exciting new finds.
So we uncovered the remains of a huge town of 250 hectares with a population of approximately 25,000 to 30,000 individuals. These were people who originated from Canaan, Syria, Palestine. Originally, they may have come here as subjects of the Egyptian crown or with the blessing of the Egyptian crown. Obviously, this town enjoyed something like a special status, like a free zone, something like that.
This sounded exactly like the Bible. Pharaoh gave his blessing by allowing the early Israelites to freely settle in the best part of Egypt. Once there, they and their flocks prospered and multiplied greatly. This was just what I was looking for. So I asked him, could these foreigners be the early Israelites?
We have some evidence of shepherders. We find again and again in this area pits with goats and sheep. So we know shepherders, probably Bedouins with huge herds roamed around this. But to connect this with the proto-Israelites is a very weak affair.
I was stunned when Manfred said it was a weak affair. Why couldn't these be the Israelites when they matched the Bible story so well?
According to my opinion, the settlement of the proto-Israelites in Canaan only happened from the 12th century BC onwards.
What Manfred was telling me is that the physical evidence of these people is centuries too early to be connected to the events of the Exodus. This is profound, because no Israelites in Egypt means no Exodus, and no Exodus means that the foundation of Judaism is a myth. And for Christians, it means Jesus Christ and the writers of the New Testament got it wrong, because they all accepted the reality of Moses and the Exodus and built their teachings on them.
We leave it here. Tomorrow I will just show you a little bit of this again and give you more time to work on the little assignment that I've set you. For now, have a blessed rest of the day.